The studio was cold, too cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. John shivered, clutching his coffee mug. The warmth from the coffee was barely enough to keep his hands from trembling. It was 2 a.m., the witching hour, and he was alone, prepping for his late-night radio show, Scary Snacks. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the equipment. He bit into a donut, the sugar a poor substitute for sleep. The sweetness did little to mask the bitter taste of exhaustion that lingered on his tongue. Outside, a storm raged, mimicking the unease twisting in his gut. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain pounded against the windows with relentless fury. He'd been having nightmares, vivid and disturbing, centered around the radio station, each dream more unsettling than the last, leaving him drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. Shadows seemed deeper here at night, the building creaking and groaning like an old man. Every sound was amplified, every creak a reminder of the station's age and history. John shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping dread. He told himself it was just his imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights and too much caffeine. It was just stress, he told himself. The pressure of keeping his ratings up, the constant fear of being replaced by someone younger, someone hungrier. The pressure of keeping his ratings up, the constant fear of being replaced by someone younger, someone hungrier. It gnawed at him, a persistent anxiety that never seemed to go away. He glanced at the soundboard, its dials and knobs glowing faintly in the darkness. The familiar sight was usually comforting, but tonight it felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. A sudden burst of static crackled through the speakers, making him jump. The noise was jarring, a sharp contrast to the quiet that had settled over the studio. He lowered the volume, his heart pounding against his ribs. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the unease lingered, a shadow that refused to be dispelled. The static persisted, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. Then, he heard it, a voice, faint, barely audible, but there, a woman's voice, laced with an unearthly sorrow. He strained to listen, turning up the volume. The voice grew stronger, echoing through the studio. It spoke of betrayal, of a life cut short, of a darkness that consumed all. John felt a chill crawl down his spine. This was wrong, deeply wrong. He tried to rationalize it away, interference maybe, an old recording bleeding through, but deep down a primal fear whispered a different truth. This was something else entirely, something sinister. He reached for the dial to turn off the microphone, but his hand froze. The voice, now clear as day, uttered a single chilling word: help. John stumbled back, knocking over his coffee. The warm liquid spilled across the soundboard, sizzling as it made contact with the electronics. The lights flickered, plunging the studio into darkness. Panic seized him. He fumbled for his phone, the screen illuminating his trembling hand. No signal. He was trapped. A metallic tang filled the air, and he realized with a jolt that it wasn't just coffee he smelled. It was blood. He shone his phone's light on the microphone. His blood ran cold. The microphone was coated in a thick, viscous substance, the color of dried blood. It wasn't just the microphone. The walls, the soundboard, even the ceiling. Everything was splattered with it. A wave of nausea washed over him. He had to get out, now. He scrambled towards the door, his hand shaking so badly he could barely turn the handle. It was locked. He rattled it again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. He thought of Sarah, the intern who usually worked the late shift with him. She had called in sick tonight, complaining of a migraine. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now he wasn't so sure. He remembered the stories, the whispers of a missing intern years ago, a young woman who had vanished without a trace. The case was never solved. He had dismissed them as urban legends, but now those legends were taking on a terrifying reality. He was living them. He slammed his shoulder against the door, but it wouldn't give. He was trapped with whatever evil lurked within these walls. Section 5. Whispers from the Archives. Desperation clawed at him. He had to find another way out. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the weight of countless forgotten memories. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back, each drop a reminder of the urgency of his situation. He remembered the old archives, a labyrinth of dusty shelves and forgotten recordings located in the basement. It was a place he had only heard about in hushed whispers, a relic of a bygone era. The archives were said to hold secrets, stories that were never meant to be uncovered, but now they were his only hope. There was a fire escape down there. He was sure of it. He had seen it once, a long time ago, during a routine inspection. It was old and rusty, but it was a way out. He just had to reach it. He raced down the narrow staircase, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Each step echoed in the confined space, a rhythmic reminder of his growing desperation. The walls were damp, the paint peeling away to reveal the cold, hard stone beneath. The darkness was absolute, his phone's light a meager beacon in the oppressive gloom. Shadows danced on the walls, creating eerie shapes that seemed to move and shift with a life of their own. He could barely see a few feet ahead, the light swallowed by the inky blackness. As he made his way through the maze of shelves, he started to hear them, whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing, but as he moved deeper into the archives, they grew louder, more insistent. Faint at first, like the rustling of old papers, but gradually growing louder. It was as if the very walls were speaking to him, sharing their secrets in hushed tones. The sound was unsettling, a constant reminder of the countless lives that had passed through these halls. They seemed to be coming from the tapes themselves, thousands of voices murmuring in unison. Each tape held a story, a fragment of a life long forgotten. The voices blended together, creating a haunting symphony that filled the air. He could almost make out words, fragments of sentences, all laced with an unspeakable sadness. It was as if the tapes were trying to communicate with him, to share their stories before they were lost forever. The weight of their sorrow was almost too much to bear. He picked up his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if urging him to hurry. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, watching his every move. He had to find the fire escape. He had to get out before it was too late. He finally found the fire escape door, a rusty metal rectangle at the end of a long corridor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the dim lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls. Each step he took echoed ominously, amplifying the sense of dread that had been building inside him. Relief washed over him. He was almost out. The thought of fresh air and freedom was tantalizingly close, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that the nightmare was nearly over. His heart, which had been pounding relentlessly, began to slow, and he took a deep breath, savoring the fleeting sense of calm. As he reached for the handle, he noticed a faint light emanating from one of the rooms he had just passed. It was a soft, flickering glow, barely noticeable against the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle, torn between the urge to escape and the inexplicable pull of the light. Curiosity, or perhaps a morbid fascination, drew him towards it. He peered inside. The room was shrouded in shadows, and the only source of illumination was the flickering light from a computer monitor. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't look away. Something about the scene compelled him to step closer. The room was small, cramped, dominated by a single, flickering computer monitor. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with old, dusty equipment, and the air was thick with the smell of stale electronics. The monitor's glow cast an eerie light on the room, making the shadows dance and shift in unsettling ways. On the screen, a face stared back at him. It was pale and ghostly, with eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. He felt a shiver of recognition, but he couldn't quite place where he had seen the face before. The longer he looked, the more uneasy he became, as if the face was silently pleading for help. It was Sarah, the missing intern. Her face was unmistakable, even through the grainy resolution of the monitor. She looked different, though, haunted, as if she had seen things that no one should ever have to witness. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth contorted in a silent scream. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear, and it sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. He wanted to reach out, to somehow pull her from the screen and into safety, but he knew it was impossible. The screen was a barrier he couldn't cross. The image was distorted, as if seen through a broken lens, but there was no mistaking her fear. The screen flickered and warped, making her face appear even more grotesque and horrifying. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the silent plea for help that she couldn't voice. It was a sight that would be burned into his memory forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the image vanished, leaving only static in its wake. The room was plunged into darkness once more, the only sound the soft hiss of the static. He stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The silence was deafening, and the darkness seemed to close in around him. John stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, and his hands were trembling. The image of Sarah's terrified face was seared into his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He knew then, with chilling certainty, that he was dealing with something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. The sense of dread that had been building inside him now felt like a heavy weight on his chest. He had to get out, but he also knew that leaving wouldn't be the end. Whatever had taken Sarah was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for him too. He ran. ran as fast as his legs could carry him, back through the archives, up the stairs, through the darkened corridors of the radio station. He could hear the whispers following him, growing louder with each step. He burst out of the studio door, into the relative safety of the hallway. He fumbled for his phone again. Still no signal. He was cut off, isolated. He had to get help. He had to tell someone what he had seen, what he had heard. But who would believe him? Who would believe the ravings of a late-night radio host who claimed to have seen ghosts and heard voices in the static? He knew he sounded crazy, but he also knew what he had experienced was real. Terrifyingly real. He thought of the stories, the whispers, the legends. He had always dismissed them as folklore, but now he understood. The radio station, a place of voices and stories, was also a conduit, a bridge between this world and something else, something dark and hungry. And he had inadvertently opened the door. He had to find a way to close it, to stop it before it was too late, before it claimed another victim. He had to warn people. He had to tell them to stay away from the static, to heed the warnings whispered in the dead of night. He had to make them understand that some secrets are best left buried, some stories untold. He had to make them listen. The storm raged on, a symphony of wind and rain. Inside the radio station, silence reigned. The only sound was the faint hum of electricity and the echo of John's retreating footsteps. He had escaped, for now, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was far from over. The darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity, waiting for someone to tune in, to listen just a little too closely, to delve too deeply into the secrets hidden beneath the surface. He had a story to tell, a warning to share. But would anyone believe him? Or would they, too, become victims of the chilling secrets revealed? Only time would tell. Stay tuned. Don't forget to like, share, and follow for more chilling tales from the dark side of